It's our very great honor to have Professor Paul Anderer of Columbia University as our speaker today, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Jonathan Zwicker, to introduce Professor Anderer to you.
First of all, thank you all for coming. My name is Jonathan Zwicker. I teach Japanese literature in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures here. And it's really, for me, quite a distinct pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Paul Anderer today, the Mack Professor of Humanities at Columbia University. Some of you who know me know already, but Professor Anderer was not just my dissertation director, my graduate advisor, he's also my undergraduate advisor. And so it's really kind of a nice opportunity to be able to do this for me. Professor Anderer actually did his BA here at Michigan after transferring from Notre Dame, and I think he's kind of happy to be back also. And then he went on to do graduate work first at the University of Chicago and then at Yale University, where he did his PhD under the direction of the late Edwin McClellan. Professor Anderer began his teaching career actually back at Notre Dame and then moved to Columbia in 1980, where he spent his career not only as a professor of Japanese literature and the longtime chair of the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, but at different points serving as the director of the Donald Keene Center for Japanese Culture, the acting dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, the associate vice president for academic planning and global initiatives, and the vice provost for international relations. Professor Anderer's work as a scholar, writer, and critic, which is of course why we're here today, has focused largely on the literature and also the cultural criticism of Japan's 20th century, and now increasingly as well on Japanese cinema and the films of Kurosawa in particular. His books include studies of the Taisho period novelist Arishima Takeo and the literary and cultural critic Kobayashi Hideo. And he's had a long-standing interest now in working on a critical biography of Kurosawa, which is really what brings him to us today. And before turning to Professor Anderer's talk, and I've been warned by him not to cut into his time, I'd like to just very briefly take this opportunity to acknowledge my own personal debt. Not only did he guide my work for a decade, but he was pretty much the person solely responsible for my ending up in this field in the first place. I had basically decided to quit Japanese language my sophomore year in college, and it was Professor Anderer who encouraged me to stick to it despite the difficulties and frustrations I had learning Japanese, and to kind of push through until a point where I could actually begin reading fiction and so forth, which is what I was interested in doing. And then the following semester I took his Modern Japanese Lit and Film course, and that's when I kind of realized that this is what I wanted to do, to study and to teach Japanese literature. And I took the opportunity to mention this here, not just to acknowledge my own personal debt of gratitude, but because the time and attention that Professor Anderer gave me so early on in my career, I think is really quite representative of the role he's performed for so many of us as a teacher and mentor over the years. And it's also one of the things about which, as a student of his, I've tried to really live up to in my own relationship with students. And in fact, I still tell the anecdote of you convincing me to stick with Japanese to students to try to encourage them to do that. So please join me in welcoming Paul Anderer, and now we will hear more about Rashomon's Shadow.
Well, it's not a conventional kind of introduction, and I have to acknowledge at the beginning that I'm so very pleased and grateful to be back. Some of the people in the field that I feel closest to are here. Ken Ito didn't mention, but we go way back. I was a graduate student with Edmund McClellan, and I was just moving from Chicago to Yale with him. And Professor Ito was a senior at Yale College, and we found ourselves, the two of us, alone in a room with the legendary McClellan. Quite an experience, and one that I got through thanks to Ken. And of course, I look back, with satisfaction and a great sense of, yes, personal, pride in the achievements of so many of my students, but none more so than Jonathan Zwicker. So I'm very grateful for your reflections and your introduction. You were too generous, and I want to move on. I have to stick to my script, but I will say I was an undergraduate here, and thanks to a lightning storm which kept us on the ground at LaGuardia for until late, we almost didn't get out. And so we didn't get to Ann Arbor until everything was almost closing except for Buffalo Hot Wings on State Street. I found myself at Buffalo Hot Wings, Hot Springs. Buffalo Hot Wings at 1 a.m. with my wife trying to get something to eat. We closed the place with about a half dozen frat guys, about as best I could tell. And then we thought, we'll take a walk in my old neighborhood, I thought. So I lived on North Ingalls. I never knew it was a historic district. I just thought it was a place that had a lot of ramshackle old places that were carved up. And, students like me could get into them. This is 70, 71. And anyway, it was very exciting. There's other stories connected with that, but I'm going to leave that for later. So let me stick to this script. There's a reverb. Is this too much? Is this good? Okay, so let's get started. So everyone here knows Kurosawa, whether or not the first film you saw was Rashōmon. Some of you are passionate about his work. A few may even blog about it. At art theaters and film societies and universities like Michigan, it has been a year of Kurosawa retrospectives, most with a zealous following. Many of us tuned into TCM's Kurosawa tribute last spring. Some have even coveted Criterion's fancy box of 25 DVDs dubbed for the anniversary AK-100, as if it were some high-powered assault weapon. Where Kurosawa is concerned, any audience, no doubt, comes armed with opinions, insights, and strong feelings of nostalgia, affection, perhaps even repulsion or awe. To all who have staked out a position on Kurosawa and mean to hold it, I say, hold on. Your view may be the true one, mine the false witness. We remember, of course, that in Rashōmon itself there are already 4 false witnesses. I thought to title this talk The Fifth Element, but didn't want to sow confusion among fans of that movie and Luc Besson. So I'll stick with the shadow Kurosawa and Rashōmon cast over the century he lived through into our own time. When Rashōmon won the grand prize at the Venice International Film Festival in 1951, Kurosawa and his production team were stunned. They'd been reluctant to even enter the competition. The lead producer claimed he never understood the film's story or what the director was trying to say. A reaction, if we're honest, many have had since. No matter, the prize was a breakthrough. Here was the antidote to all the newsreels circulating in America and Europe at that time, documenting a pathological Japan, a defeated nation trailing in its dismal wake. What's going on? Okay, it's still okay, right? Trailing in its dismal wake the atrocities, the kamikaze, and other macabre acts of self and communal sacrifice. Rashōmon in Venice marked the victory of beauty over the beast of Japanese shame, just 6 years after the war's end. So the Daiei producers swallowed their doubts, took the prize, and went home knowing there was an audience outside Japan for what today we would call the, quote, soft power of Japanese culture. Kurosawa had a different reaction. He took the win and relished the acclaim abroad. Doesn't he look happy? Gina Lollobrigida, for those of you who don't know. But he thought the prize went to the wrong film for the wrong reason. He worried that the ancient costumes, the lure of the exotic, was what put Rashōmon on top. He regretted not having won the prize for one of his modern life films, made from the ruins of the 20th century, because it was to give us potent visions of that life, not to front a beautiful image of Japanese culture, that he was making movies at all. Kurosawa was born in 1910 in Tokyo. Between that time and the making of Rashōmon in 1950, the city of his birth and upbringing would disappear, not once, but twice. Just before noon on September 1st, 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake struck. By the following night, the fissures and flames that raged through the Tokyo flatlands had taken over 100,000 lives, laying waste to nearly 3/4 of its buildings, most gutted by fire and reduced to ash. Again, as the horrific war in the Pacific was nearing its end, B-29 incendiary bombing missions fell in Tokyo. The raids of March 9th and 10th, 1945 were particularly intense. The firestorms in their wake incinerated over 16 square miles near the city's center. Upwards of 125,000 people were killed, over 2/3 of Tokyo's residences destroyed. The number of Tokyo's dead after each of these calamities exceeded the death toll at Hiroshima. After Tokyo's first disappearance in 1923, once the tremors and fires had died down, Kurosawa's older brother Heigo, about whom I'll have more to say, took Akira with him to survey the devastation. For an entire day, they walked through the charred remains of their city. At the banks of the Sumida River, they confronted a mountain of corpses pressed against the shore. In his memoir, Kurosawa claims he resented his brother for forcing him, he was 13 at the time, to face such terrifying sights, likening what he saw to a, quote, lake of blood in a Buddhist hell. Around him, as far as the eye could see, there was no sign of life. The only living things in this landscape, he later wrote, were my brother and I. When Kurosawa saw Tokyo in ruins again in 1945, this brother Heigo was dead. It was in the summer of 1933, a catastrophic year in the political life of Japan, as it surely was in Germany, that Heigo Kurosawa, age 27, committed suicide with a lover at the Yugashima Onsen on the Izu Peninsula. He had been the favorite son, the academic star of the family, who abruptly left school and home behind in defiance of what was expected of him. He had obsessions: subversive politics, Russian literature, silent film, all of which he shared with Akira. He found entry-level work in the movie industry, climbing up the ranks to achieve stature in it, until sound technology made his skill obsolete. His younger brother, who idolized him, would follow Heigo down every strange path he took. At the end, accompanied by their father, Akira would follow him to Izu to bring his brother's bloody corpse back to Tokyo. Kurosawa said this brother was, quote, irreplaceable for him, his story, the one he didn't want to tell. Now, I'll ask you to keep these backstories and this history in mind and look again at the opening sequence in Rashōmon. And I have a couple of clips, if I'm clever here. Sorry. I've got to manually get this. There we go. A massive twisted wreckage of a gate looms in middle distance through a scrim of driving rain. Beneath its overhang, we can dimly make out human figures. There are just two of them. Elsewhere, as far as the eye can see, there is no landscape, no other sign of life. This gate is a summons, no doubt, but not to approach the exotic. This landscape comes to us from no colorful Oriental past. Rashōmon's opening brings us face to face with Kurosawa's vision of the modern world. Indeed of a city, his city, the one he twice saw disappear, whose ruins he surveyed once with his brother, and as a filmmaker in the post-war, without his brother except in spirit, the one he returned to and drew strength from again and again. One of the brothers, Kurosawa, gave us films of tremendous life-changing force. The other stands to one side, in the shadows of these moving images. Heigo was the first Kurosawa to enter the movie world, but his fame was short-lived, and his life was over before his younger brother set off down the same career path. Moviegoers to the Kanda Cinema Palace, to the Ushigome-kan in Koishikawa, or to the Asakusa Taishokan in the late 1920s in Tokyo would have known Heigo Kurosawa, though by another name. That's not Heigo, by the way, pushing the carriage. He worked at theaters such as these, specializing in foreign films streaming in from America, Russia, and Europe. He was a benshi, or as they came to be referred to in film journals by the mid-20s, a setsumeisha, known professionally as surateme, trained to be one of the live narrators who gave their voices to the silent movies of the day. Popular performers in their own right, such film narrators did more than provide cultural decoding and historical background for the Japanese audience watching Orphans in the Storm, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Battleship Potemkin, or The Last Laugh. They became, at different intervals in the screening, the voices of all the characters, swashbuckler, waif, porter, and jazzed the plot line and intertitles with lyrical riffs, ironical asides, or mood-inducing shrieks, groans, and whispers. They were once affectionately known as poets of the darkness. Their voice modulation took skill and stamina, as well as an actor's persona. Besides being heard, the benshi, somewhat akin to oral performers at kabuki, joruri, or rakugo, were also visible, if faintly, to the audience throughout a film's projection. They added a dimension of life to the parade of voiceless images, creating, as Tom Gunning has used the term, a cinema of attractions. The coming of sound movies by the early 1930s in Japan changed all that. Despite a futile effort by the Benshi Strike Committee, a particularly famous one led by Heigo Kurosawa himself, to hold back the technological tide of the time. In June of 1933, out of work, out of luck, a pariah in his own family, Heigo took his life. No wonder that the shadows overhanging the post-war work of Akira Kurosawa should possess such force and dramatic intensity. These cinematic narratives of ambition, destruction, survival, and rebirth are more than just history tales, allegories, sweeping across the cultural planes of Japan's 12th, 16th, or 20th centuries, as the argument often goes. In their shadows, it is possible to see and hear a more personal narrative, a story of one brother's rise and fall, and of the other's work to recall their life together in its vitality, complexity, and memory-shaping force. But if Kurosawa were just reminiscing about his childhood or his autobiographical past, as he would do in some later color films, such as Dreams and Madadayo, if his films had a merely personal dimension, we may not still be puzzling over their mysterious expanses and carefully calculated depths. We should note that the era of Kurosawa's upbringing, corresponding precisely as it did with the high moment of silent film, was one of fierce political and cultural debate and experimental forays in all of the arts. For example, while his brother Heigo was narrating Fritz Lang's Metropolis at the Cinema Palace in 1929, Akira was exhibiting his labor paintings in Ueno under the auspices of the Japan Proletarian Artists League. By the late 1920s, the proletarian in literature and cultural criticism did indeed hold a dominant position in Japan, but it vied for attention amid breakaway or openly competing artistic and political forces: anarchism, surrealism, Dadaism, futurism, aestheticism, German expressionism, Russian constructivism, to name a few. Two of the greatest Japanese writers of the day, Tanizaki Junichiro and Ryunosuke Akutagawa, openly flaunted the 1920s cultural flux in their fiction, their writing styles capturing the speed and fracture of all the surrounding change cinematically. Together with Hashimoto Shinobu, his longtime screenwriting partner, Kurosawa would in fact build Rashōmon from two of Akutagawa's short stories written around this time. In Akutagawa's case, it was as if he knew that the vibrancy and the experimental tumultuousness of the 1920s could not last. His suicide note addresses his vague foreboding over the future. To be sure, the curtain came down swiftly on the cultural avant-garde and the electric sense of new possibilities in the air of that time. The militarists and right-wing ideologues, seizing power in the early 30s, moved decisively to enforce conformity to the imperial mission, a confessional purge of Western ideas, a romantic purification of the culture's imagined essence, a euphemistic embrace of Korea, Taiwan, Manchuria, the Philippines, and Southeast Asia under the mantle of the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. The horror of the war that followed, the reign of a long darkness, the specter of constant surveillance and the shame-filled silence of the culture makers and intellectuals, all this too falls within the space and time boundaries that Rashōmon's shadow captures and enfolds. In other words, whatever aesthetic reasons Kurosawa had to turn back and adapt elements of silent film to his purposes, he fashioned his most telling scenes, his most complex, fallen characters, from the stuff of a history, both public and private, that he had lived through, admitting in his memoir regret for his own silence and evasions, and that he was stubbornly determined to project. Let me pursue this issue of Kurosawa's relentless turning back to the past, pushing open doors others wanted closed, including American occupation censors, who wanted brighter, more optimistic images, from yet another angle, by addressing a curious, if seldom remarked on, feature of Kurosawa's filmography. Long after color films in Japan became an aesthetic and a commercial possibility, Kurosawa made one after another black and white feature. Through the 1940s, of course, though also through the 1950s, when color was making serious inroads in Japanese cinema, and even through the color-saturated 1960s. Of the 30 films Kurosawa would direct, 23, from Sugata Sanshiro in 1943 through to Redbeard, 1965, are in black and white. In quantity and in quality, we can talk about this later, they overwhelm the later sporadic color productions, whatever scenic splendors those films possess. And there is this. Kurosawa didn't make and see to completion, because he kind of worked a little bit on Tora 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 until, anyway, for other reasons, he wasn't part of that at the end. But Kurosawa did not make his first color film, Do Desu Ka Den, until 1970. Shortly after he did so, for the first and only time, he himself attempted suicide, as if in abandoning black and white, he had betrayed something or someone. Such a long-standing fidelity to black and white needs to be reckoned with and accounted for. Kurosawa was known to be difficult for Japanese studio executives to handle, but there seems to be scant evidence that he clung to black and white come the 50s just to defy the studios, which were in fact pushing color to hold an audience, defecting to the little black box of TV. After Rashōmon won the grand prize in Venice in 1951, Kurosawa became a charter member in the ranks of the internationally acclaimed art film directors. Again, there is little to suggest that he shared, for example, Bergman's sense of the higher purity that attached itself to films made in black and white. Nor was another 50s phenomenon, the global impact of Zen and its minimalist voids, a philosophical or artistic motivation for Kurosawa. To the contrary, many of his scenes are anti-minimalist, full of branches, beaded curtains, debris of all kinds. In a word, visual clutter. And so his choosing black and white, then persisting in that choice for over 25 years, while most everyone else switched to color, including older, more conservative auteurs like Ozu and Mizoguchi. This must hold some other meaning. We need to look for it elsewhere, I believe, amid the recollected voices and looming images Kurosawa retrieved from the wreckage of a lost past. Kurosawa had a prodigious imagination, and many of his scenes are composed of bold, uncharted, unanticipated movements. But his work also tracks along memory paths, veers through byways or hollows of desire and of tragedy. And none of these paths seems more traveled, none of these ties more binding for Kurosawa than those that lead from and tie him to his lost city and to his brother, the Benshi, whose voice once brought silent film in black and white to life. As Jean Mitry argues about how memory coheres in cinema, such memory is not controlled by chronology or objectivity, but by a personal vision, to which I would add in Kurosawa's case, by a personal voice, too. Rashōmon is the hinge here, built up by a taut compression and repetition of images that opens out to reveal a winding, backtracking story, one that binds Kurosawa's work as a post-war artist to conditions of life and art in the pre-war past. I believe he had a deeply personal stake in going back there. But for Kurosawa, the filmmaker, the personal turned to face, at a sharp artistic angle, the political and moral challenges of his time. In Japan, no other narrator of the 20th century rivals the dynamic range of his imagination and his achievement. None was as stubbornly driven to tell stories that took on the scale of the desperation and the shame, of the material and the spiritual ruins left in the world's wake, while capturing, too, the giddy sense of being still alive, defiantly clinging to hope, looking for signs, however wishful, of reconstructive will and redemptive strength. To credibly work on this expansive scale, Kurosawa's post-war black and white films keep mere realism at bay. Large gestured melodrama. We can talk about this with Professor Ito, who has written, as has Jonathan Zwicker, powerful studies on this genre in different centuries. To credibly work on this expansive scale, he keeps realism at bay. Large gestured melodrama becomes his expressive mode, as it was the dominant mode in silent films across national traditions, including Japan's. A mode absolutely suited to the mercurial expressiveness of Toshiro Mifune, Kurosawa's longtime collaborator, and to Machiko Kyo in her Rashōmon performance. Even Kurosawa's explicitly modern life films, with locations and dress coded to fit an urban neighborhood, loaded with realistic period details of tactile immediacy, holes in the office girl's stockings, methyl alcohol as the available drink, regularly gives way to allegory-charged melodrama. The flat surface of realism breaks, fault lines and fissures open up, and characters fall or rise up as if from the dead, pursuing each other across shifting spatial and temporal planes. Those stills, as you know, are from Drunken Angel. Since the advent of the talkies in the 1930s, Kurosawa would write, we have misplaced or forgotten what was so wonderful about the old silent movies. I had to go back into the past. But not just any past. Kurosawa had made period films during the war years. The Rashōmon marked his first venture into this genre in the post-war. Like his post-war films about modern life, such as No Regrets for Our Youth, Drunken Angel, Stray Dog, Rashōmon, no matter its 12th century period dress, by its severe framing of life amid the ruins, of survival in some aftermath, is also self-consciously addressing itself to the cultural dead zone left in Japan at the Pacific War's end, if also to the disappearance of Tokyo at the time of the earthquake in the 1920s. As we have seen, Kurosawa begins with the 3 shots, each from a slightly different camera setup, all amid a driving rain, reveal this ruin looming in middle distance, rising, as it were, from a clearing, an expanse of flooded emptiness, of mud. I like to tell my students, and sometimes I think it's actually true, that it's all about the mud with Kurosawa. Kurosawa was fixated on this single set in pre-production. It cost him the bulk of the film's budget. He later described how it kept, quote, growing in my mind's eye until it reached, quote, startling proportions. Known for his exhaustive historical research prior to making any of his period films, Kurosawa further confessed that none of his investigations could yield the detail he wanted to authentically apprehend or to scale this ruined structure. As late as the mid-1980s, when he wrote his autobiography, he would bring it to a close with his account of making this film, even though he'd made 15 films in the interim. As he ended his memoir, Kurosawa admitted tellingly that, quote, somehow I can't pass through the Rashōmon gate and on to the rest of my life. He was a survivor, of course, twice over, both of the Great Kanto earthquake of 23 and of the fire bombings of Tokyo in the last months of the war in 1945, who had seen death and destruction on a massive scale. This experience was firsthand and visceral. even if it did not take, at those times, the lives of his immediate family. But amid all the anonymous carnage, all the treachery, lies, and violence that line the cultural and political landscape in Japan between 1923 and 1945, one death for Kurosawa was distinct, unforgettable, incontrovertible: the bloody suicide of his brother, away from the city, in the country somewhere. We recall that in Rashōmon, amid so much that seems open to interpretation and to question, the one incontrovertible fact, amid so much that seems open to interpretation or to question, is that there is one dead body pierced by a blade. Looking further inside Rashōmon, there is one story, among the several reconstructions of the crime scene, that calls a special attention to itself. It is the only one which will feature a single actor at the time of death, instead of the three principal actors, bandit, samurai, wife, all three, or at least two of whom, are conspicuously present throughout the various other accounts of what happened. This is the tale told to us by the dead man himself, the samurai, which its hearers, woodcutter, priest, and cynical drifter, listen to as if to an old ghost story. Here is the first part of that sequence. To tell the ghosts, that is, the dead man's story, Kurosawa turns to a relic of popular religion, as well as to a vocal style and stagecraft reminiscent of the No theater, a theater, we should note, that features the wandering ghosts of slain warriors and unrequited lovers, and which is marked by a liturgy of exorcism. He introduces here a new character, a shaman, who for the period of her trance and recitation lives in two worlds simultaneously. She is present, whirling in the dust of the courtyard, and the samurai is present in her voice, which she will then throw onto the projected images of this forest scene. In other words, the shaman is functioning like a movie commentator, a benshi, standing to one side of the action on the screen, using her voice to express the meanings latent in those silent images. She will provide the clearing and a voice for the one who found himself lost and alone in a forest. In that sense, this she is also a he, just as a benshi like Hego, in fulfillment of his role, would have used his voice to become not just the characters played by Rudolph Valentino or Emil Jannings, but also by Lillian Gish, Mary Astor, Dolores Del Rio, and so on. We observe how repetitive and necessary are clearings to Kurosawa's work in black and white. The untilled land in No Regrets, the sumps or urban cesspools in Drunken Angel or in Ikiru, the vacant urban square in Stray Dog or in Record of a Living Being, the circle of dust at the beginning of Seven Samurai. Such clearings emerge all the more strikingly for all of the entangling detail that otherwise fills Kurosawa's scenes, elements of the natural world or of the social environment that repeatedly obscure our vision, stand between us and the apparent object of our scrutiny. All of the leaves and branches in his many trees, the piles of books and papers, the crowds on the back streets and in the black market, all the cabarets, honky-tonks, and bars. It is as if the entanglements are there to provide the actuality, if to the alibi available to any of us caught up in the details of everyday life. We can't quite see where we should go, what it is we should do. We are lost in a forest and can't find the way out, the road ahead. But then comes the clearing, when we are set in a stark existential face-off, with or against forces which exert a higher claim on us, determine our character because they demand confrontation with usually hidden parts of the world or of ourselves, even the enemy within. But there is no clearing anywhere in Kurosawa which opens up quite like this one, with the samurai and the voice of the shaman in the forest. This is the second part of that sequence. Here, the atmosphere transforms. Gone, as mentioned, are the other main characters. Gone, too, is the bolero pastiche, replaced by minor chords of melancholy. We see the samurai unbound, but on his knees, and he is weeping. No one hears him, nor would we, if not for the voice of the spectral shaman, herself caught inside the sand and dust-filled courtyard, whirling inside a dance of someone else's making, embodying for us the last sounds, the last movements of this distant character, alone now in the forest clearing. This is, of course, a death scene, but it is different from the others. There is no long sword and no murderer. Instead, we become witnesses to the final moments of a desperately shame-filled, lonely man. He is about to take his own life with a blade, apart from home and family. Yet for the time that Kurosawa takes to shoot this scene, to search out and to find such a man as he is about to die by his own hand, we become his companions, his intimates, and in this sense, accompany him on his final journey. Led by the exquisite, haunting beauty of these wordless images, we enter a world gone quiet and rescue the dead from oblivion. Rashōmon has less to do, it seems to me, with the relativity of truth, so much as it has to do with the self-deception and the ignorance within which we live our lives. About to the wonder that such lives should leave their mark on us at their passing. In this scene, at least, death is not captured relatively, but inside a solemnity and a finality, art giving us the clearing we need to mourn the dead. Indeed, it is the very darkness of the scene, the mysterious encounter through the shaman with death and with a man who chooses to die, that renders the ending of the film both intelligible and necessary. Here we will encounter Rashōmon's final clearing, the cessation of rain, the outburst of sunlight, the sudden appearance on screen of an abandoned baby, and of its salvation. Because the shadows of Rashōmon have been my focus here, I have not detailed as much as I might have the many instances of opening, or of stabilizing possibility that the film builds into its often dark and foreboding structure. So let me recall with you how, peeking through the forest entanglements, amid the writhing bodies and the struggling confusions, there repeatedly appear pieces of a sky, glistening water, indeed sunlight. And the film has been giving us strong geometries to cling to, as if a world of forms was always available to our sight, as if such seeing were a beginning, a means to restructure even a broken life. Everywhere, Kurosawa, aided by the great cinematographer Miyagawa Kazuo, tracks down and exposes distinct lines or swirls that hold up this shattered world. The vertical columns of the gate's pillars and the forest's trees, the striated horizontal layering of the steps, the triangles formed by the position of limbs and bodies, by buttresses or by splintered shards of wood, the circling clouds or the round ball of sunlight radiating down through the canopy of trees. And so there is a rightness and a symmetry to the sudden appearance of the abandoned baby at the film's end. This child, defenseless against weak and scheming men, is nevertheless embraced by a force that stands up against the ruins, resists the moral collapse everywhere else in evidence. The woodcutter, if only at the end, and suddenly, as if it were a Dostoevskian conversion, discovers an impossible good inside himself. He takes an action eked out in parables that line both Buddhist and Confucian thought. His compassion rescues an innocent, the act which Mencius said defined our humanity. Even in a fallen world, it was Mencius' claim, so long as we are human, we would reach out to save a child, not just our own, but any child, from danger. From the mid-1940s through the middle of the 1960s, Kurosawa projected onto the screen black and white forms and geometries shot through with the heightened drama of his personal and family life, as well as of modern Japanese culture and society. Again and again, Kurosawa and his staff built cinematic stories lined in darkness and fear, until from out of the shadows one of these unlikely heroes breaks away toward the light. We have already seen Rashōmon's opening sequence. Here is the one by which the film ends. The abandoned baby in the woodcutter's arms may or may not represent rebirth from the dead, the resurrection of Kurosawa's own lost brother, a will to live in the aftermath of horror. But as he did at the film's beginning, Kurosawa clears a space and focuses on just two figures at the end. And to sharply counterpoint the driving rain that shrouded Rashōmon's opening, bright sunlight fills the close, as the woodcutter, with the baby in his arms, leaves the ruins behind. We all but feel this weak and dispirited man, who is saving himself not by his words, but by his action, gain power with his every sunlit stride through the mud, until his motion and his arm move toward collision with the camera, with all of us in its final setup. Thank you.